Okay, I think that's it. So, hello everyone. This is another session for the Jenkins X Open Office hours. We're going to probably just do a bit of a chat to what's been going on the last couple of weeks around Jenkins X. As always, feel free to ask questions. Anybody to be involved. It's a community thing, so more feedback and more involvement from anybody else other than people that talk too much, like most of us on the call, then it'd be really good. Yeah, so I think today we've got probably two things we can show. I think Gareth's going to maybe talk through some of the work he's been doing around adding a tutorial for Jenkins X on GKE. I can probably talk through some of the Prow stuff that I've been looking at. But before we start off, is there is there anything interesting anybody would like to share? Any questions from anybody? Don't be shy. Ian, you're the person that's up on my screen that I can see. So anything new from you other than your Starbucks?
Oh yeah, I'm highly caffeinated today. Very, very caffeinated indeed.
You've been doing some stuff around Chart Museum.
I've been doing a variety of random things. Yeah. So the Chart Museum stuff was interesting. It's actually a really good way into not only sort of the project itself, but also sort of like our deployment and like our infrastructure and how maybe it differs from like a sort of vanilla install. So yeah, I kind of rolled all of that stuff up. The background to this is basically we serve all of.
Has anybody else lost sound? Was that just me?
I've lost them as well.
Yeah, me too.
Ian, I think we just lost. You've cut out there slightly. Maybe we can come back to you. You still there? Maybe we'll come back to you. I guess, Gareth, did you want to talk to us about the tutorial that you've been doing?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. Apologies, because I'm sat in quite a noisy place, because I'm in Cardiff city centre at the moment, trying to cheer on Geraint Thomas. He's about to do his victory lap of Cardiff for the Tour de France. So I'm sat in the quietest place that I can find, but it's everywhere's really noisy. Yeah, I've been working on adding a tutorial or a set of tutorials to the Jenkins X website. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know when you can see this. Does that come through?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, great. So these at the moment we've put two tutorials up there. They're both based on GKE, and they are both using the sort of the Cloud Shell feature. And it seems to be a fairly recent feature that they've added to add sort of inbuilt tutorials into Cloud Shell. I'm just going to show you one of these now. So if you click on one of these, it's going to launch your Cloud Shell. It assumes you're already logged in with an account. It will boot to the right place. If you've already got the 2 seconds, if you've already got it open, it's going to ask you to update it, and then it actually loads the tutorial on the right hand side of the page, and it allows you to it already thinks I've already started it, because I have. I've just dismissed that, and I can start bouncing through this tutorial, and it gives me prompts on what I need to do. And you can make these as complex as you need to. So just as an example, one of the really nice things you can do is you can click on this paste in Cloud Shell button, and it will actually copy and paste the command into your shell, and you just hit enter and it runs. And that's going to go off and install Cloud Shell, install JX of the latest version, and any other dependencies that it needs. It takes about 30 seconds roughly, maybe a little bit less today. And once that's complete, you can say I've completed that part and go on to the next step. And then if you need to go and create something here. So I'm going to try this command. This is actually going to create a Terraform cluster, and I can just follow that through like I normally would. So it seems like a really, really powerful feature, and something that's quite new in. I haven't. There's a few things where you seem to be able to launch like a local dev proxy. So if there's something you were booting on the or inside Cloud Shell, you could then get it to open up a web browser window to that local app. But I haven't got too far into that yet. But in terms of just generally building out tutorials, I think it's a great little tool.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's certainly going to be useful for some of the workshops we've been running, and for people that just want to get going fast without having to download any binaries, JX binary, or if they have some odd restrictions as well. So a lot of people which might have lockdown laptops, corporate laptops. This is another great way to kind of kick the tires of Jenkins X.
Yeah, and all of these tutorials here seem to work so far, at least within a sort of a GCP trial account. So it doesn't require you to have any extra permissions or something.
That's awesome.
Excellent.
Nicely done. And that's on the website now as well, yeah?
That is just gone in, yes.
Excellent stuff. Nice stuff. All right. Okay, Ian, you're back.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, yes.
I don't know what happened there. It's very strange. You just decided to cut the sound. It obviously had enough of me talking too much as well. And it just decided to cut out. Yeah, so highly available chart museum, basically packaged as a chart itself. So there's a sort of custom chart, which I've just called JX Infra. It's like the snapshot tag. And basically, if you install cluster with that, you'll get GCS copy cron job running to basically sync your index, and you'll get Chart Museum starting up, connecting to a GCS bucket. So you basically get, you obviously get the Chart Museum itself, like the sort of the destructive API is actually, you can obviously query that in order to push stuff up to it. But if you make the bucket public, with that little sort of sync job running in the background, it means that you can literally just give people the public address of the bucket itself. So in terms of GET requests and all of that kind of stuff, you don't even actually need Chart Museum, the server, actually running. So, you know, you could conceivably tear down the entire cluster, everyone still be able to pull the charts. Yeah, so that was all done. That's all done. Other things I've done. Oh yeah, I did. This was just because I saw a couple of people. It was partly for myself, just because I like the idea of being able to sort of debug specific versions, and it's particularly people that are committing and doing PRs and stuff like that. Also, I saw a couple of issues raised about JX version on the JX repo. So I kind of rewrote part of the make file yesterday, and also added a bunch of tests and other stuff into JX for the versioning. So basically now, if you are a contributor, then if you clone the JX repo and you start building locally, basically if your master branch is on a tag, then you'll just get a tagged version. But if it's not, then you'll get a suffix dev version with the dev suffix and commit hash. So you can always see which version you're using, and you won't get prompted to update constantly anymore if you're on a dev build, which is just kind of like a little thing really that I just thought would be really nice to have in there.
Great stuff. Awesome. So we should be. I'll probably help out.
Yeah, I was just about to. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on. So I think this is the latest.
I was just
you
going
go
to
on.
Yeah. Just yeah, one other little thing which just sort of developer ease type thing, which I've just been quickly playing around with earlier, which was shell completions, because JX is quite a sort of complex binary. We've got lots of commands now, and it's really difficult to remember and type. So I just added in a little, basically another command that lets you generate bash and zish completions.
I thought we had that. I'm pretty sure we did.
Yeah, we already have that.
Yeah.
I couldn't find it anywhere.
I think it's called completions. I think it's there. It's so hard to find. There's so many commands. It's easy to miss.
Yeah. Oh well, if we've already got it, then
it's called JX completion. There you go. It's in the chat.
Already.
Never mind.
But great idea, though.
Yeah. Obviously, someone beat me to it. But yeah, it's just because I was basically messing around with one of the other things I picked up is basically sharing or adding users and sharing access to a JX cluster. And I was chatting with James about with other James about how to do that, and potentially adding some custom resources in that will enable us to kind of share those things out really easily, and kind of you know, sort of fine grained control rather than just you know, sort of exporting or packaging up basically all of our auth and then just kind of sharing it around. Because obviously the sort of I'm thinking about the sort of the user story being basically that some sort of system administrator or admin will be probably the person that's sort of creating the cluster, and then it's going to be their job to sort of give out that access to various teams so that they can actually do their work. And I imagine that the most sysadmins are pretty scared about giving out sort of admin level kind of privileges to everyone. So it seems like a you know, we've had a sort of good conversation with a bunch of people from the community about, you know, what they would like and what they want to see, and it definitely seems like they, you know, having kind of even just sort of fairly basic set of roles in the beginning, maybe, you know, sort of before just kind of like admin, developer, you know, viewer kind of thing, would you know, sort of make it a lot easier for us then to kind of share those things, share access around without sort of compromising the security of the cluster at large. So yeah, looking at that at the moment, it's quite interesting.
I think a lot of people be looking forward to that, because I think that's quite a common thing, wanting to add extra team members to your
it's a very regular request.
Yes.
Regular request.
So
trying to just sort of knock off some of these sort of you know, sort of regular requests and things that will really kind of add value to people's you know, experience and stuff. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Awesome. No, look forward to seeing it. Thanks, Ian. So is there anybody else that wanted to share anything? I can show some stuff around Prowl, but give an opportunity for anybody else. James, go on, you've been quiet.
I was maybe going to mention Knative, but I wondered if you should do Prowl first before we lose track of going to Knative. But basically...
no, go for Knative, go on.
Okay, let's mention Knative really briefly. So Knative was announced, was it 2 weeks ago? I think it was announced after the last office hours. So in between the last office hours and this office hours, there's now a Knative thing, which is basically a top, like a group of bits of open source backed by the usual, Red Hat, Google, Pivotal, and various others. And the idea is an open source project around serverless is the main focus. And it's trying to have a Kubernetes native serverless platform really that runs on top of Kubernetes in the normal Kubernetes modular microservice kind of way. There's really three parts to Knative. There's the webhook piece, there's the serving piece, and there's the build piece. The serving piece is using Istio, so that's kind of cool. So it's combining Istio with a serverless kind of serving mechanism. So you can, for example, have no containers running, and then a HTTP request can come in. You can then scale up a container to service the request, and then tear it down again, and have nice elastic serverless style running of containers. So that's really cool. The bit that's really interesting from a Jenkins X perspective is Knative build, I should say. Knative build is very similar to things like CodeShip and Circle CI and various other CI tools and Concourse, and there's almost everything apart from Jenkins these days tends to use Docker containers and simple steps in Docker containers. Argo, again, is very similar. You define a pipeline in terms of steps. Each step is a Docker container and a command in the container, and you chain them together. So it follows that kind of similar pattern to lots of CI tools that's out there. What's particularly interesting, though, is it's a fairly small controller. It takes a CRD to define builds, and then it's got a controller that turns those CRDs into pods. What's really interesting, which I found quite surprising when I first saw it, but then the more I thought about it, the more awesome it appears. Knative build is turned into a single pod, and each step is an init container in the container. So that each step is then discarded. It runs until the Kubernetes waits for the init container to start and complete. Each init container has an exit code, and it passes or fails. And then if it's good, it goes to the next step, and next step, and next step. So it's kind of really using Kubernetes to implement the pipeline engine, which is kind of interesting, because the build is just a regular pod. There's nothing weird or wonderful about it. It's a regular Kubernetes pod. It's just the CRD takes a build resource and turns it into a pod, which then runs the build using a normal Kubernetes stuff. So that's really interesting. Incidentally, the command JX logs we've had for a while. I'll just type into the shell. There's a command JX logs, which lets you iteratively output the log of a pod. And usually you give it like the name of a deployment or something, and it'll pick the newest pod for deployment and tail the log. I did a patch last week to JX logs, which if you want to tail the logs of Knative, you just do JX logs and then give it the label name build-name, which is the current default label on the Knative build pod. Then it will basically find the latest Knative build pod and then log each init container, in other words, each step in order. So you can just tail the log really simply, because that's one of the problems right now is trying to find out what the logs are for Knative is not immediately obvious. So anyways, that's a bit of a ramble. Knative looks really interesting. Given the backing of Knative and it's the serverless, and serverless is pretty hot right now in the general software development scene, I can see lots of people investing a lot of time and effort into polishing Knative. Right now, it's very simple and basic. I mean, you just run a couple of commands and that's kind of it. Knative itself doesn't have a webhook thing yet, which maybe segues into your stuff, James, with Proud. But it does look like, if I was a betting man, I'd kind of say this is looking like a long-term strategic pipeline engine. What's interesting is you can embed in Knative build any build tool, whether it's a shell script, a Jenkins file, any kind of language or processing engine or whatever. It can be Bash scripts, it can be Perl, Python, PHP, whatever. So this is just orchestrating the high-level Docker images. The actual detail of those images could do whatever you want. Right? The other thing that's interesting, by the way, about Knative versus things like Argo, if using Argo, each step is a separate physical pod. And so that if you want to share state between steps, you have to like sync everything to S3 or Minio or something, and then sync it back again to the next step. With Knative, a Knative build pod is all the steps are in one pod, and each step has a workspace folder, which is mounted for every init container. So you can just share content between each steps without doing anything or syncing anything, which is kind of nice. So yeah, Knative is really interesting. It's definitely one to watch. Another thing, well, I should have probably got these links ready. Well, I'll tell you what. Shall I switch to you, James, and you talk about Prow, and then when that's finished, I'll mention some of the other bits and bobs in the Knative Jenkins X world. Because I didn't think of talking about this, and I'll need to look up the URLs so I can show you.
Might be worth putting the URLs on the page. I don't think if people watch this back on YouTube, they don't get the chat history.
Yeah.
So it might just be useful as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's add it to the doc. Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah, the doc.
Yeah, the Word doc, the Google doc.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about Prow. I'm going to share my screen. Share. So somebody could tell me when you can see this.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So Prow's really interesting. One of the challenges I think we've been trying to solve, I think, with around having pipelines on Kubernetes is ensuring that we don't have a single point of failure. We want to ensure that we can always get the webhook event from when changes are pull requests are raised or pull requests are merged into GitHub or different Git providers, and how we then handle those events, making sure that we're not actually upgrading Jenkins, for example, and we could miss those events. One of the other really cool projects that's been around for a little while now, which is from the Kubernetes ecosystem, is Prow. Prow is being used by the Kubernetes projects, also other related projects too, like Istio and Knative using it as well. What's kind of interesting is we're looking at adding this in. We've got this actually running already for our own services for JX to a certain degree. I really there's a diagram here. It's under the Kubernetes test infra is the Prow Git repository, and there's a little diagram here. I don't know if you can see this, but I just thought I wanted to go through this very quickly. There's a lot of parts to Prow. There's a lot of terms, lots of different names. You get used to them, but a lot of them are implementation detail. Jenkins X is trying to initially hide these implementations, but you can go down and have a look as usual if you want to. So we have events coming through from GitHub. Say a pull request is opened, and that event is sent over to this webhook handler. This can be highly available. You can have multiple replicas, Kubernetes replicas, so we can perform upgrades, for example, and rolling upgrades to the hook handler controller, and we won't miss any events coming from GitHub. Now, what this does, this event then sends and creates a custom resource definition into Kubernetes of a Prow job, and we have a controller here, which is called Plank. And this will then actually start up the pod and actually run the actions. In the Prow configuration, there are Kubernetes pod specs. So you just add a Docker image name and then your commands that actually for that Prow job runs. So it's really kind of cool, nice and simple, highly available. So we get scalable as well, and it's being used by probably some of the most largest projects on GitHub, most active projects on GitHub, so we know it's scaling that way. There's also a UI and some various other things that help with periodic batch jobs and cleaning up as well. But those are the main ones. There's also a UI called Deck. What's really interesting then is since the Knative was announced, sorry, my daughter's in the background, apologies for that. Since Knative has been announced, there was a pull request on Prow repo, actually adding some support for a build controller, which will actually have Prow jobs handle Knative builds, which is kind of cool. I've been getting a bit more familiar with the Prow repo with the code base, and probably adding in some extra bits to actually handle with when you're raising pull requests, having the statuses get synced back via Prow. So kind of we're going to be pushing, submitting that upstream as well. And hopefully we'll get some reviews on that and get a better understanding if that works. We'll get that all merged in. But in short, we should be able to have in Jenkins X support for Prow, so highly available webhook handler and eventing, and creating Knative jobs, being able to actually use these using the CLI, the JX CLI we're actually familiar with now. I can give a little bit of a quick demo. It's not amazing, but I can just kind of show something in a second. So we've started using it slightly on JX, but not fully implemented yet. What it does, first of all, when you raise a pull request, actually, we have Proud plugins, so you can actually see it analyzes the size, for example, and adds labels. Lots of these controllers actually perform actions based on the labels on the pull request. For example, there's something called Tide, which will automatically merge a pull request if it has all the appropriate labels and doesn't have other labels such as hold or work in progress, for example. So let's actually just start by, I've got a test repo, Proud test. I'm on a branch. I'm going to create a pull request from my branch, work in progress. So I'm going to give it a work in progress title because we're going to see one of the plugins that Proud has. I'm going to create a pull request from my work in progress branch into my master branch. So that's going to go away and have a little think. So that has sent an event into the hook handler, and that's then commented back on the pull request. Because we had work in progress in the PR title, it's actually added a label of do not merge. That means that if it was accepted or approved, and if it was all the correct labels were added to it, Tide won't actually automatically merge it until that label has been removed. Makes sense. We've also added this comment. So we don't have an owners file in here yet, but an owners file contains owners of the repository and reviewers that can actually be recommended and automatically assigned to that pull request. And we can see, this is the bit I haven't quite figured out quite yet, but we've automatically run the test. We didn't actually want it to run that straight away, so I've got to fix that or figure that out. But the idea is you can now start making comments on the pull request. So test this, for example. If we run that, let's do get pods -W. It should work. Oh, it's already started here. We've got this is a Knative build pod that's actually been started with an init container. It's actually cloned the source, that source code, that pull request. It's actually running the unit test for that test project, and then it's successful. So we should see that the status update should go to successful on that pull request. It should go in a second. Whilst that's going, it's got other things like other kind of seems to be developer workflows that people are getting familiar with. Like looks good to me, for example. I'm not sure if I can actually do that one because it's my own pull request. Obviously, the status checks actually passed, so the job succeeded. So let me just wind back very quickly. What we've got is CI for running using Prow and Knative for Jenkins X project, which is kind of interesting. Still a bit more to do, but it's kind of very exciting. Knative, as Jane said, was only announced 2 weeks ago, so it's lots more coming. But yeah, it's very exciting times.
Yeah, I was just going to show something really. I guess for the next office hours, I should try a real demo of Knative with Jenkins X. So I don't actually have a real demo right now, but I was just going to mention 2 little things that happened last week. If I quickly share my screen, which tie into what James just showed. Just share my screen. We have a little controller. I'll show you the docs. We have a little controller command, which if you type JX controller build, we kind of need to package this up as a Helm chart, which we haven't quite done yet. But if you basically run this command line, JX controller build, it watches for all of the pods generated by Knative and any pods which start or stop or steps happen or whatever. We basically mirror the Knative step statuses into the CRD we have right now for looking at pipeline. If I open the shell a second, get this bit bigger. Actually, 1 second. I should have done this earlier. Make a big shell. If you type JX get activity, and I'll filter by demo, this is going to list all of the pipelines which I've just been working on right now. So you can see here's a pipeline. This is a Jenkins pipeline, but here's a pipeline where we checked out some code. We did a release. We released 001, and then we did a promotion, and blah, 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 blah. The usual kind of stuff. What's happening? Excuse me, I just got a call. Should have turned off my phone before this. We do the normal JX get activity stuff, which really is just using a Kubernetes CRD under the covers. If we do kubectl get act, we'll see here's all the different pipeline activities, which if I look at my last pipeline, kubectl get act minus o YAML, pipe into more. This is the YAML of the CRD pipeline activity, where we define various metadata like what's the release name, what's the Git URL, what's the branch, what's the tags, and so forth, and also what all the steps are. Now, what this new JX build controller does is whenever you run a pipeline, Knative build, we generate the same CRDs for Jenkins pipelines and Knative pipelines, which basically means we can use one tool to visualize all the pipelines, either from the command line. All the VS Code and IntelliJ and Eclipse plugins all use the same CRD. So it doesn't really matter if you're using a Jenkins pipeline or a Knative build pipeline, the same set of developer tooling, the CLI, the REST API, the IDE plugins, and the Cloudbees web console, all of those visualize things in the same way, which is kind of nice. And so hopefully, yeah, all the same tooling should apply whether you're using Jenkins for doing your pipelines or whether you're using Knative, it should kind of work the same. One other little thing I thought I'd mention is, here's a quick example of, this is a Knative build resource. So you can see at the top, it's part of the Knative version and the kind is build. So this is a CRD which defines a build instance. And this is just the Git repository and the branch or whatever. Here I've just got a single step called release, and I'm using the Jenkins X Maven builder. And I added a step last week called JX step release. So this is, I'm slightly cheating. I thought, well, what's the quickest way of getting Jenkins X to work in Jenkins X pipelines to work inside Knative? Let's just write a big Uber step that just does everything to do a release, which just chains together all of the internal pipeline steps. So rather than writing a really big pipeline, I just cheated and just did one command. So basically under the covers, what that does is the same as our current Jenkins file. It, you know, sets up Git, it does a clone, it generates a version, it tags everything, it pushes everything, and does all the promotion. So that's a one command line version of what our Jenkins files do. You'll notice it also mounts Docker socket and sets up a secret for Maven settings. But this entire blob of YAML works in Knative for doing a Knative build to do a release pipeline for Jenkins X, which is kind of, I was quite surprised how simple this was. So, you know, we should be allowed let people choose, really. Do they want to stick with their Jenkins server and keep everything in a Jenkins file? Do they want to go YAML and use Knative build pipelines and use whichever, or maybe even combine them, you know, trigger some Jenkins pipelines after Knative build steps, or the other way around, have Jenkins pipelines trigger Knative build steps and whatever. One other final little thing I just thought I'd mention that was a very experimental thing. I raised an issue last week about if people started to use Knative pipeline steps, how could we maybe make it simpler to use the two things together, to use CI and CD like we do in Jenkins X with configurable steps and with things like build packs and whatever. I won't get into this whole issue, have a little read offline if you'd like, but the basic idea is some prototype code that lets you take, we have a Jenkins X YAML file, which is optional, which can just define which build pack you want to use. So given the build pack, we could generate the Knative build YAML completely from a library of build packs. So rather than having to copy and paste these big YAML files into all of your Git repos, we can just reference them in your Git repo. Or you could specify, override various different pipelines. In Jenkins X, we tend to have different logical pipelines, like the pipeline that runs on a pull request, the pipeline that does a release. We can separate those into different YAMLs or blocks of YAML and let people completely override them in each repo or inherit them. We could maybe even look at doing things like pre-post steps. So you might say, I want to reuse the standard release pipeline, but before I push the Docker image, I want to do this or something like that. So whether you want to copy and paste the whole thing every time, or you want to reference it by name, or whether you want to just add certain pieces before or after things, we should be able to let people just define very dry bits of YAML, which is very concise, but gives you the full power to, you know, completely do whatever you want on every project. So yeah, that was just a bit of a ramble. I'll put all of these links into the Google Doc if anybody fancies noodling all this code after this meeting. So that's me.
Awesome. That's really great stuff. It's really, I think we've just been kind of blown away a little bit about the potential around Knative, and it's certainly going to be quite exciting to be following that project. So
yeah, it's quite surprising how nicely it fit into Jenkins X as well. Like we weren't really expecting Knative to turn up. We just figured that one day there would be some kind of Kubernetes-like thing. But it was quite surprising how quickly we've just been able to, reuse our IDE plugins, our CLI with Knative, and actually reuse our builds inside Knative. It's been quite surprising how quick it just fit in. And it was a spooky timing because we're just looking at Prow, and almost within the same time, Knative arrived, and Knative and Prow became a thing. And Jenkins X and Prow and Jenkins X and Knative all kind of happened within a week or two, which is still very early. And I wouldn't recommend anybody really go into production with Knative build anytime soon. But it's certainly looking like it could be a nice, simple option. Plus, another thing we've always kind of figured at some point, it might be nice to have a SaaS option for Jenkins X. So that if you just want to use Jenkins X, but you didn't want to run any infrastructure or manage anything yourself, use something like CodeShip or whatever for all of your release pipelines. In many ways, CodeShip and Knative are basically the same pipeline. They're just running Docker commands. Things like CodeShip and CircleCI, they're hosted. Knative runs in your cluster. So I think the Knative thing fits very well with a potential SaaS version of Jenkins X at some point, where you might want to use CodeShip or Google Cloud Builder or something like that for your releases. But still have the same UX of Jenkins X. So I think it's a really interesting time. I mean, everything's changing very rapidly in this space these days. It's fun.
And it's also great that everything's using CRDs as well. These are Kubernetes native solutions.
Exactly. And the other thing that's really interesting is, so right now, okay, Prow isn't quite finished in Jenkins X, but it's kind of close. But you have the option, use Jenkins for releases, add Prow for promotion, use Jenkins for releases and promotion. So you can pick and choose which tool you wish to. You could use Prow for webhooks, Jenkins for releases. So you could basically pick and choose what you're going to use for webhooks, what you're going to use for doing releases, what you're going to use for doing promotions. And you can plug and play exactly what pieces you wish. When we do multi-clusters, I really kind of prefer the idea of Prow in staging and production, because you want a simple lockdown promotion workflow, pipeline build step that hardly does anything and never really changes. You just lock that down and then you're done. You kind of don't want a developer-centric tool that lets you spin up and import projects whenever you feel like running in production. You kind of want that in your dev cluster. So I think all these different options is going to let people choose exactly what they want their infrastructure to be. Like maybe Prow is used in production and staging just for promotion only, like no Docker builds, no releasing anything, just promoting released stuff. And then maybe use completely Jenkins in development, or maybe use a hybrid of Jenkins on some projects, Knative on others, or whatever, and pick and choose based on the app what you want to use, but have the whole thing integrated together. I think that's a really compelling thing. I mean, Knative is not going to be a good fit for lots of things. Certainly things like mobile apps and stuff like that is going to be terrible for, but for lots of things like making little containers and releasing them, I think Knative could be pretty compelling.
Yeah, one of the other things, I mean, you mentioned about multi-cluster as well, because currently our answer to that is to install a Jenkins in each cluster to handle the promotion, because we're just leveraging the hook, the webhook.
Or worse, let your dev cluster be like cluster admin on all of your clusters, which is even more scary.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But now we could just do a lightweight part of Prow, so just the hook, for example, that starts at the job and then runs the Prow job of doing the Helm upgrade. And one of the other good things is, you were just asking me before about what the size of it. The memory footprint is like 60 meg or something, and it was 0.1 of a CPU. It's so it's very, very lightweight, low footprint.
Yeah.
But it's also, Prow has all the secret setup as well, so for the webhooks, so that's all nice as well. So it does feel quite certainly a much better fit than what we were using before. But yeah.
And plus probably want to do a cron job as well. So as well as just the webhook thing, for promotion, I mean, so for promotion in Jenkins X, you probably just want to go, you know, every hour, let's do a reapply just in case there's been drift and, you know, somebody's done something crazy in production. Let's just keep reapplying what's in Git in case weird shit happens, kind of thing. So yeah. I think the combination of prow and cron jobs looks a good one. And you know, one day maybe Knative will have its own webhook thing that might use some of prow or whatever, who cares? It doesn't really matter. We could switch to some other webhooky thing. Maybe there could be a simpler, leaner, meaner webhook thing that is baked just for promotion. So it's hard coded to do one job only ever, you know, or something like that. That's all great. We were talking to somebody this week who they have their own custom built webhook thing for production, which has been through their security checks and whatever. And it's like, fine, if you want to use some custom webhook thing of your own choosing, you know, some Lambda, whatever, crack on, you know, it's all good. So I think that modularity of Jenkins X is going to serve as well in the future and let people, you know, tweak things and configure things to suit exactly what they need rather than this, you know, one size fits all monolith. And
that's because of the focus around GitOps, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
So having Git being the thing, the source of truth, and then people, like you say, can then, if they have a particular way of actually implementing or applying that, then that's cool.
Yeah. I think also this came up on the chat room today, people were asking about things like Spinnaker. I think one of the really nice things about having a Kubernetes native solution for all of this is it's all microservices all the way down using Kubernetes to connect everything together. So if you want to change a webhook handler or a cron job handler or a load balancer or a thing, you just switch a piece in an infrastructure and it all kind of works. So I think having Kubernetes native solutions for all these things all the way down the stack is going to really be the best long-term solution for all of us. I think that lets us all move forwards in a much faster, better way.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting times.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
I can show the single sign-on operator if you are.
Oh, sorry, we forgot to mention that. We should have gone earlier, but I wouldn't have rambled about stuff.
Let's hope it works. I can share my screen that you can see. Okay, let me share it. Do you see my screen?
Not yet. Oh, yes.
Okay, so let's have a short introduction to this single sign-on stuff. So what we try to achieve is to make this single sign-on setup quite easy for Kubernetes applications. And we try to base all the pieces on well-known open source components. So one of the main component is DEX, which is a OpenID Connect provider federated, which has connectors to many identity providers you can see here, like GitHub, GitLab, Microsoft, Azure Active Directory, Google, and so on. So basically, it's a proxy towards this. And it's quite nice, lightweight, Go, written in Go, starts quite fast. Also, it has a nice gRPC API. If you look here, you can manage it over gRPC. And the idea of this single sign-on operator is to have a operator which takes over all these setup steps to configure a single sign-on for a service. So, and everything is in this Jenkins X single sign-on operator. I wrote a bit of documentation, and yeah, I can show it. Currently, I managed everything with Jenkins X. So we have a DEX installation, we have a single sign-on operator installation, and we have a vanilla Golang HTTP service for which we want to set up the single sign-on. So if we check the staging environment, we have currently 3 pods running. And I have here the logs from the single sign-on operator. Maybe we should have a look into the single sign-on CRD. So basically the operators listen to watches this CRD, and when the CRD is created, it takes over all the steps to set up SSO. So if we look inside of the CRD, basically we see there is this OpenID Connect URL, which is the URL which points to DEX identity provider. Depends where it's installed. So either in the same cluster, or typically it is in the same cluster. It could be in the same namespace, or it could be in a different namespace. Also, we can define the upstream service. So we just need to define the name of the service for which we want to set up the single sign-on. Then we need a domain, because this service is the single sign-on for this service, which will be publicly exposed under this domain. And then it's just typical like proxy image, which image we want to use for the single sign-on proxy, and then some cookie specific configuration, like how long we want to keep the cookie, if it's sent over HTTPS, or yeah, these kind of things. So that's it. So I can now go and just let's put this to watch the pods, what's going on. So we have this here. Now I create this SSO resource. So the resource is created. Now we see that the first operator has created the OpenID Connect client into the DEX using gRPC API. Now it deploys the SSO proxy. It waits for the proxy to get ready. So the pod is not yet running. So it waits until the proxy is up and running. When the proxy is ready, it will expose the proxy publicly using the expose controller. It runs the expose controller as a job. And we see now it's the service was running. Now it runs the expose controller. Expose controller is running, it's ready. Now what it does, it gets the public endpoint of the SSO. It sets this public endpoint as a redirect URI into the DEX for this specific client. And then it restarts again the SSO proxy container in order to get a new configuration. So this takes a bit. And yeah, it waits now again for the container to be up and running. This takes a while. It's relatively fast. Now it's kind of running. So now it's done. Now the SSO CRD is marked as initialized. So now if we go here and just, let's say we try to get the ingress or staging environment, we have this SSO Golang HTTP ingress here. We can just take it. I forgot to mention the DEX identity provider is configured with GitHub connector. We have a GitHub application for the DEX identity provider. And now I will open this SSO public endpoint, and I will log using GitHub. So I have this. Now the DEX login window shows up. So now I can choose GitHub. I already logged in on once, so I have also the DEX configured to work only with Jenkins X organization. So I already grant access to this. So now when I say authorized, so I logged in. So now I'm logged in. So you see now the SSO HTTP shows up. It returns the code. Now we can go and check that the cookie was created for this. So we can check, we see here in the cookies, the cookie should be content settings, cookies, show all cookie, and then we have this. So we have this cookie. So it was created for this service. We see our name, whatever, we configure it. So now if I go back, so now I can do whatever I want. So I can So cookie is set up. I can log in again, whatever. So now if I delete a cookie, try to log in again. So it shows me again the login setup and whatever. So now I can log in, and I already logged in. So GitHub keeps track of my authorization, and it doesn't ask again to authorize the DEX to connect to my. So that's it basically on this side. So I wrote a bit of documentation here, how to install basically SSO operator. We kind of not really forked DEX, but we create our own DEX repository based on the upstream repository, because we wanted to set up Jenkins X to do like continuous deployment of DEX into Kubernetes. And we have our own chart based on the open source stable charts here. It's just the DEX, which has a few jobs here. So one of the jobs, it generates the gRPC certificates. It's a self-signed certificate, and it stores the certificate into some secrets. The problem is if DEX runs in a different namespace, we need to copy the certificates from the DEX namespace into the SSO operator. And into the SSO operator chart, there is a job which can be enabled. Like if you deploy SSO operator in a different namespace than DEX, we can enable this job, and the job, it will copy the gRPC certificates from DEX namespace into the SSO operator namespace, and then the SSO operator will be able to connect towards DEX. So by default, if you deploy both in the same namespace, you don't need to enable this. So the SSO operator will be able to detect the secrets and fetch the client and servers, the client certificate and the public certificate of this, because it's a self-signed certificate. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, if you don't want to use Jenkins X to manage the operator, you can also use Scaffold and Helm to install it. And then here a bit of details how you can create and run the like a CRD. So one probably is our next thing to fix, is to see how Self Manager and TLS work together, that we can expose DEX over TLS and also create SSO proxy, which is exposed over a TLS endpoint, that everything. So this is absolutely must to have. Without this, it's kind of not very secure setup.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
It's awesome. That looks awesome. Snap.
Okay, cool. We've got 5 minutes left. Anything else anybody wanted to share? Go once, twice. Okay. Again, in 2 weeks. Well, in 2 weeks' time, I'm not sure. We'll have to send a note out whether we can make the 2 weeks' time, because I think maybe a few of us are traveling, but we'll see. But yeah, okay. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.